So it's a real pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, who comes highly recommended originally through the New Hampshire Humanities Organization. Her name is Marina Kirsch, and I'm going to read from her intro so we can learn a little bit about her before she takes the stage. She'll talk about her family's experiences tonight in Latvia, in occupied Poland, and then in Germany before, during, and after World War II, as recorded in her book, Flight of Remembrance. Her presentation, given at over 115 venues so far in 13 states, will provide a unique perspective while helping to preserve memories of World War II and the Holocaust. Her presentation includes parallels to the current conflict in Ukraine and encourages audiences to share their personal and collective memories, as well as adopting a lifelong dream, a goal, or a vision powered by love and supported by faith. So about that, the presentation will take generally an hour, but I think if you have questions and comments, there'll be Q&A afterwards. And then Marina is planning to be here to sign copies if you'd like to take one home with you. Marina immigrated to the U.S. with her family after World War II and has lived in, it says, lots of places, exclamation point. She's currently a resident of Kensington, a beautiful town in the southern part of New Hampshire. In addition to being an author, she's a mostly retired freelance graphic designer. She's a book designer and editor. She's also a New Hampshire Humanities speaker, which is how we came to know of her program, and an officer and distinguished Toastmaster with the Exeter Speak Ups Club in Exeter, New Hampshire. She considers it a pleasure and a privilege to connect with audiences. And so that's what we're going to do this evening. Without any further ado, I want to welcome Marina Kirsch in her presentation about Flight of Remembrance.
Thank you, Jeff.
Well, thank you.
I am really delighted to be here with all of you, and I'm going to launch right in. Is there value in a story from the losing side of a world conflict? That's a rhetorical question that you don't need to answer, but it is a question that I asked myself for many years before I ever decided to write my book. Because as we all know, Germany was not only the country that lost World War II, but it was also the country that directly or indirectly was responsible for the death of 50 to 70 million people worldwide. Now, these days, I think we might need a new perspective on those figures. After all, with defense and relief budgets in the billions, we might. Because after all, we're talking about human lives, not currency. So here's a new way of looking at those figures. If you were to bury 10 people per day, it would take more than 13,000 years to bury 50 million people, and more than 19,000 years to bury 70 million. Now, I would like to thank Leah Dearborn, the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire, for inviting me here, but also New Hampshire Humanities would have normally supplied a grant. Now you notice the logo is up here on my slide, but this is not actually a humanities presentation. And the only reason is that DOGE cut very deeply into the humanities. More than 50% of their funding is gone. However, good news is New Hampshire Humanities plans to continue, but they will be much more dependent on donors like you. My very last slide will have a QR donation code for New Hampshire Humanities in case you're willing to donate. Last but not least, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I'm really delighted that there's such a nice turnout, and I thank you in advance if you're able to make a donation to the organization that funded 600 presentations, more than 600 across the Granite State last year in 172 communities. It is a wonderful organization. This evening, you will hear part of the story that's recorded in my book, Flight of Remembrance. The two main protagonists are my parents, Rolf Dutzman, a Latvian aeronautical engineering student, and Lilo Wasul, the young woman that he met in 1940 Berlin. Way back in 2004, when I was writing a movie treatment for this story, I was too lazy to write a book. I thought, oh, just going to take way too long, Marina. But I couldn't figure out what to do with the movie treatment afterward. But someone in my class said this, but it's a story about Nazis. Well, I kind of felt something like that might be coming sooner or later. I'm grateful to that man that he said that. But what he didn't know is that no one in my family joined the Nazi Party or supported Hitler, a fact that comes as a surprise to many American audiences. And I was able to confirm that about the Nazi Party on a German database, online database, that gives the names of I don't know how many thousands of Nazi Party members. And I was relieved, even though my heart was in my throat, to find no one in my extended family on either side was on that list. Now, what's to be gained from a story from so long ago, from the losing side of a world conflict? Humanity doesn't seem to learn. Wars are still waged. Genocide is perpetrated. We just don't seem to learn from history. But I can say one thing, that we need to know what happened in the past in order to move forward in the future. And the more we study history, the more equipped we are to do that. There are 5 takeaways. First, the story promotes remembrance of World War II and the Holocaust at a time when eyewitnesses are rapidly disappearing. I still had 2 World War II veterans recently. I was down in Florida doing presentations. I had a Holocaust survivor, and I had the spouse of a World War II veteran. But that was a big surprise for me, because previous to that, the last World War II veteran I had at a presentation was in 2019, a 96-year-old female Navy veteran who walked in straight as a ramrod, no walker, no wheelchair, no cane, sat in the front row, bought a book, asked questions, and asked for a photograph to be taken with me. I was so delighted to have her there, and I miss them showing up more often these days. The second thing is the therapeutic value of a story that gives a face, a name, and humanity to the enemy, which is not something we might hear very often. Also, the story points out the ravages, it clarifies the ravages of war waged on home soil, something that was only experienced here in the U.S. when? Civil War, yes. And also, it gives a clearer sense of what Ukrainians are experiencing today, those who fight and those who flee. In addition, this story points out the warning signs and perils of dictatorship, in addition to also providing, affirming the value of love, dreams, and faith in God for survival in adversity. So now I have questions for all of you. The first question is, did your ancestors, please raise your hand, if any of your ancestors served in World War II on either side of the war? All right, we have a lot of hands up here. Keep your hand up if they served on the Axis side of the war. That would be Germany, Italy, Japan, lesser Axis nations. My hand is the only one up, I guess. Also, did you or your ancestors live in any of the places where the war was fought during the war? Now, none of you look old enough for that, but did you? How about your ancestors, parents, grandparents? Okay, yes, where did they live? In Poland. Whoa, we're going to hear a little bit about Poland tonight, too. And in the back? Greece. In Greece. Okay, were any other hands up?
Parents were born in Vienna, and they lived in, my mom's family lived in England.
I'm sorry, where?
England.
England. Okay, thank you very much for that. And by the way, I'm always happy to hear stories from World War II from people attending. Maybe we'll have some time for that afterward if there's anything else you would like to share. Inevitably, I learn things at these presentations. So thank you in advance. Now I'd like to give you my family story in a nutshell as shown on the cover of my book. The guy with the helmet, my father, Rolf. After he had fled with his family from Latvia to Germany before the first Soviet takeover, Germany was the only country that would accept Baltic German refugees. And my parents, Rolf and Lila, wedding day, November 1944. My older brother, Ingo, born in post-war Germany, and flying in up top, might be a little hard to see from back there, a little pre-War II Latvian glider. Now, this was an illustration that I did from a photograph of my father flying that glider in pre-war Latvia. You'll see that photograph in a little bit. And that little icon represents two things to me. First of all, my father Rolf's overarching goal in life to further the field of aeronautical engineering. It was his passion, it was his dream, it was his motivation in life. He wanted to be a part of that. And secondly, it represents my desire as my father's daughter to gain a higher and wider perspective on World War II through the researching, the writing, and now the presenting of my family's story. And like I said, I often learn things from members of the audience, so thanks in advance. The finalist award symbol from the 2012 USA Best Book Awards in the narrative nonfiction category. It was a surprise. Now, how many of you have read this book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl? Okay, a few people have. What did you think of it? Amazing book, right? I found that it was a powerful, life-changing book. In the first half, he talks about his Holocaust experience. In the second half, he talks about logotherapy. So Frankl was a Jewish Holocaust survivor who, after the war, founded the third Viennese school of psychotherapy known as logotherapy. And logotherapy helps people find meaning in their life. Frankl found meaning through suffering, even at Auschwitz. He wrote, "Nothing in the world would so help one to survive even the worst of circumstances as the knowledge that there is a meaning in one's life." Yes, indeed. I read that and I thought, yeah, yes. My parents and grandparents never knew about Frankl, never read his books, and yet their story illustrates key concepts of logotherapy because for them, it was their dreams for the future, their love for each other, and their Catholic and Lutheran faith that helped them to make wise decisions, to find meaning, to go forward in their lives, and to visualize a future beyond the cataclysm that they already knew was coming. It is meaning that helps us to build our future. And my hope is that my family's story, Frankl's book, and other things on my suggested reading list that I'll send you if you sign up on my mailing list with your name and email address, that those will also help each of you navigate tough times in your life. I give these presentations in high schools too, and I hope that it will help some students. I'm going to pass this around. Let's time travel now to 1924 Latvia. My father, Rolf, is a little boy, second from left, with his mother, Maria, his little sister, Ruth, and his father, Ernst, in Latvian military uniform. Guess what? Ernst had a dream. And Ernst's dream from the youngest age, sitting on a hillside of his family's farm in Latvia and gazing out at a sliver of the Baltic Sea on the horizon where he could see the ships going back and forth. He wanted to be captain of a ship bound for America. But that wasn't possible before or during World War II. My father, Rolf, is at left in this photograph. He's about 14. And for many years, he has already been building model gliders from plans in both German and American magazines. He can already speak, read, and understand the English language, a skill that would save his life toward the end of the war, actually after the end of the war as well. And here, at age 18, he's holding a national award-winning glider. And he's gone as far as he can with gliders. By this time, he's building his first motorized, full-size motorized plane and his first manned glider. Here he is flying that manned glider. He's with a group of young men called the Izargs in Latvia. The Izargs were the closest thing that Latvia had to a National Guard in that window of peace between the two world wars. But the Izargs were completely disbanded as soon as the Soviet takeover occurred. Now here, you'll see something interesting. You see a dress hanging here. You see a dress that my grandmother Maria is wearing, and you see me wearing that same dress on the right. I used to wear it for every presentation. My focus now is twofold. First, preserving it, but also allowing my host venue to get out of here in time in the evening rather than staying for an extra half hour for me to get out of it. So I would like to show it to you better, though. This dress was hand-tailored and embroidered by my grandmother Maria, my father Rolf's mother, in early 1930s Latvia. It is an authentic Latvian embroidery design, as confirmed by a costume museum in Riga, Latvia, where I had hoped to donate this dress, but they told me, "Oh, we're sorry, we only take clothing from before 1900. What do you think? Do you think if I wait another 10 or 15 years, they might take something from the 1930s on? So it was made in the early 1930s. We have other beautiful examples of my grandmother Maria's embroidery and other needlework that she did, some of it also from the World War II time period. But this dress, I find, is a total treasure. In my book, you will see 3 photographs of her wearing this dress. We have other treasures. We have photographs, 132 included in the book. I was choosy. I have no idea why. I could have added many more. We have documents, even from World War I, my grandfather's military documents. We have letters, particularly letters that my parents wrote to each other. We even have some letters from Werner von Braun. But the biggest treasure that we have is a family history that was written by my parents, Rolf and Lilo, in the early 1990s and given to all of their children and grandchildren. When I had that volume in my hands and I read it from cover to cover the first time, I realized what a treasure my family's story is. And I decided somehow I was going to find a way to share it. And you could say, I guess, that that is my dream in life. I want to share not only their story for encouragement, for inspiration, but I also want to share a little piece of history. Which country do you think was most feared across Europe, especially by people of German ancestry? Any guess? Who said that? Yes, sir. You are right. Soviet Union. Also known as Russia to a lot of people, but you're right, it actually was called the Soviet Union at the time. I use the terms kind of interchangeably. Winston Churchill once said, "The menace that Russia poses to all of Europe is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma." And that menace exists again today, doesn't it? Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shown that that menace has not gone away. Now, at the time of World War II, it was Joseph Stalin who was the leader of the Soviet Union. On the surface, boy, Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt both felt he's a likable, fatherly kind of guy. But in actuality, he was one of the most brutal dictators and mass murderers of all time. There was a dichotomy there. And also there was a paradox during World War II, and my family's story illustrates it perfectly. And that is that the Soviet Union was essential to Allied victory. And the Soviet Union lost more military and civilian casualties. They had more casualties than any other world nation. And yet, in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union was as much or more feared than Nazi Germany by many, many people. I'll explain that a little further in a bit. Let's continue on with the story now. Rolf is in the middle of this photograph with his girlfriend Vera and his sister Ruth to the right. And he has just started in 1939, October, he's just started his aeronautical engineering education at the University of Riga. He is in heaven. His dream is coming to pass. But then an ominous phone call comes from his father, Ernst, urging him to come home immediately. And Rolf knows something big is up. His father, Ernst, had gotten wind of the fact, as a military officer, that a Soviet takeover was imminent, not only of Latvia, but also of Lithuania and Estonia. And for people of German descent scattered all across the face of Europe, they didn't just live in Germany. There were pockets of German people all over Europe, and for them, a Soviet takeover posed a far greater risk of execution or deportation. But the only place that most of these people could flee was Nazi Germany. And here is the other paradox of my family's story and that of millions of other people, that the diabolical regime that masterminded the Holocaust and the death of over 9 million people, including more than 6 million Jews, that same diabolical regime at the same time was the only refuge for millions of other people who had nowhere else to go, like my father and family. My grandfather, Ernst, he was a very young Tsarist Russian officer in World War I. That was his first risk factor. His second risk factor, as you saw in the prior photograph, he was a Latvian officer between the two world wars. And his third risk factor, he was an outspoken anti-communist, and everyone around him knew that. For the Dutzman family, the verdict on Hitler and the Nazi regime was still out, but the Stalin regime had long been recognized as a brutal, oppressive regime with very little respect, if any, for human life. The family knew what they would have to do. It was love for each other, their dreams for the future, and the fact that all of those dreams and caring about each other helped them to make wise decisions. And the decision they made at that point was, we're going to flee. We are going to escape Latvia while we can. They could have given up and just felt total despair. They could have been overcome by this, but no, they decided to flee. Rolf, with his mother Maria and sister Ruth, in late 1939, shortly before they, Ernst, and over 50,000 other Baltic Germans fled Latvia for Germany by ship. And their sense of foreboding was chillingly accurate. After the Soviet takeover, Latvian officers who failed to flee were shot on the spot, and tens of thousands of other Latvian citizens were either deported or executed. The presidents of Latvia and Estonia died in Siberia, and in Poland, almost 22,000 Polish intelligentsia and military officers were shot in the Katyn forest. That was blamed on Nazi Germany, and the truth only came out after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Eastern European nations, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, but also parts of the Western Soviet Union, including Ukraine, suffered wave upon wave of tragedy. This photograph is from German military archives, and it shows part of the Holocaust that took place in Latvia. So as we know from history, first there was the Soviet takeover in 1940, then the German takeover of 1941, during which 75,000 Latvian Jews were heartlessly murdered. And after that, in 1944 to 45, another Soviet takeover, each time wave upon wave of deportations, executions. It was a tragedy of major proportions. And in those Eastern European countries, there was no right or wrong side to the war. Remember I said that to many people, the Soviet Union was far more feared than Nazi Germany, and those countries were right in the path of both regimes. Depending which regime took over, that determined whether you would live or die, and whether your family would live or die. Wow, there's an airport right near here. This is exciting. So which regime took over determined if you would live or die. A German takeover, by and large, was a death sentence for Jews. But for many others who feared the Soviet Union much more, it felt almost like liberation at first. Now here's an interesting fact. I hope you can hear this. I love the sound of planes. In Estonia, so let me just point out, here's Lithuania, here's Latvia, here's Estonia. The Germans came up from here, they went into Lithuania, they killed the Jews. They went into Latvia, they killed the Jews. Then they entered Estonia, but there the Jews had prior knowledge of what had happened. 75% of Estonian Jews fled with the Soviet troops when they left the area. And most of them survived the war in the Soviet Union. So you see, it very much depended who you were as to which side, Nazi or Soviet, you feared the most.
We had 2 aircraft are gone now, so sorry about that.
Oh, I thought that was exciting. I would like to live here. All right. Mark Twain once said, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. And I have to agree. In the light tan is Germany proper, including East Prussia, off to the right. In the darker tan, countries and areas that Germany had already annexed, including the former Austria and half of the former Poland. The other half in red and partly off the map, taken over by the Soviet Union. There was a secret pact, between the Soviets and Germany, that they would not attack each other. They would just simply move in and take over large parts of Eastern Europe. Further north, the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Now, the family lived north of a larger city called Liepāja. You'll see it flying in on the Baltic Sea. They lived in a military enclave called Kara Osta, right on the Baltic Sea, where my grandfather Ernst was head of a department in a munitions laboratory. My dad, Rolf, often joked that Grandpa was an expert in anything that went bang. But he also was an expert in building custom radios. He was tremendously interested in astronomy and photography. So he had many, many passions in life. Now, when the family fled, they fled from the capital city of Riga via the dotted line that you see, going down to an island called Usedom in the Baltic Sea, which was part of Germany proper. As soon as their ship left the port city, they and the 2,000 other people on board became people without a home, people without a national identity, and people who had absolutely no idea what their fate would be under the Nazi regime. For one thing, the men could be immediately drafted, and that was my father Rolf's main fear initially. But another thing happened that they were kind of dreading. They were sent first to occupied Poland, to the city of Posen or Poznan. So I mentioned two names initially, a German name of the city, Posen, and Poznan, which is a Polish name. But with subsequent mentionings of those cities, I will only use the Polish name. Now I'm going to move on to another map. We have to talk a little bit about what's happening today. And I think a lot of Americans and people all over the world are not familiar enough with the EU and with NATO. And these days, we really need to be informed about what's happening in the world. This is a map of EU nations. But first of all, I need to backtrack a little bit. In 1945, after World War II ended, the United Nations was formed. But with the Soviet Union as one of the allied nations, also on the Security Council, with full veto power, the United Nations is completely powerless to change the trajectory of the war in Ukraine. In 1949, however, NATO was formed, which is the military alliance in Europe, but the US and Canada are also members. And in 1993, the EU was formed, which is the economic organization in Europe. So on this map, in medium green, are the EU member nations. And that includes Sweden and Finland, which are also now members of NATO. They applied to NATO last year or 2 years ago when the war in Ukraine began, so that would have been actually 2022. They applied almost immediately and were accepted this past year. So they've decided we don't want to be neutral anymore. In the darker green are non-NATO or non-EU nations by choice. That includes Switzerland, UK, and Norway. But the latter two, UK and Norway, are members of NATO. Other non-EU nations, including Ukraine, are in the light green. And those include a couple of nations that are members of NATO, like Turkey, but it also includes countries like Ukraine and Little Moldova, nestled in the southwestern part of Ukraine, which have applied to either NATO and or the EU, but are just not accepted yet. In the red are Soviet, or I should say Russian, territories. And for all practical purposes, that includes Belarus in the light red, a country that is an ally of Russia and allowed the Russian troops to enter Ukraine across its southern border. Crimean Peninsula just flew in. The little peninsula, well, it's not so little really, at the southern end of Ukraine was taken over by Russia in 2014. Now you're looking at this map and you're thinking, what is that little triangle of red right in between Lithuania and Poland? Does anybody know? Kaliningrad. Yes, Kaliningrad. Very good. I had no idea what that was or even of the existence of it until the war in Ukraine commenced. And then I saw an article discussing it. That little triangle of red exponentially increases the threat for all of Europe, but especially for the Baltic states. They have their backs to the Baltic Sea, and otherwise they're almost completely surrounded by Russian and pro-Russian territory, with the exception of 65 miles of common border between Lithuania and Poland. That's their only common border with any other EU nation. We are so fortunate here in the US that we have Canada and Mexico at our borders. But European countries have faced existential threat for all of their history. And it is both the EU and NATO that now are essential for security and stability, not only in Europe, but across the world, all around the world. It is possible that the way that the US will react to what's happening in Ukraine and also to NATO will determine whether Russian aggression will be tolerated or deterred. Oh, there's Kaliningrad. Just came flying in. Back to the story. Rolf on the train to occupied Poland. He is apprehensive. He is wondering, writing in his diary and wondering whether the regime will immediately draft him or will they allow him to finish his aeronautical engineering education. At the right of this photograph, or left of this photograph, my grandmother Maria, Rolf's mother, also pondering what the family's fate will be. Their immediate fate, they were housed in crude, unheated barracks in Poznan. The food was equally dismal, and they slept on the floor on straw. But that didn't last very long. Next, to their dismay, they were sent even further eastward, even closer to the Soviet threat, to Litzmannstadt or Łódź. What were they thinking to pronounce L-O-D-Z, Łódź? But that is the correct way. That too did not last long, though. My grandfather's skills were far too advanced for any job that could be found for him in Litzmannstadt. So next, the regime was catching on. They sent the family to Berlin. And there, they drafted my grandfather as a major into the German army, the Wehrmacht, and sent him back up to that island of Usedom, where he trained under Werner von Braun for V-2 rocket inspection at a place called Peenemünde. Now, how many of you have heard of Peenemünde? Okay, quite a few of you have. And Werner von Braun? Okay, you know probably that our U.S. space program was basically established by Werner von Braun and his team of people. Now, that installation of Peenemünde on the island was bombed in August of 1943 by the Allies. And next, the regime sent my grandfather to an underground installation, top secret installation, near a place called Nordhausen in the Harz Mountain region of Germany. And it was there that he worked for the last 14 months of the war as chief inspector of the V-2. Did you see that little dot flying in? That is Danzig or Gdańsk, located on the Baltic Sea in a little narrow corridor of German-occupied Poland. I will get back to that in a bit, and I wanted to have you see where it's located. Now, yes, take a look at the areas that are tan and brown on this version of the map. This was in March 1940, and now see the catastrophe that was Europe by mid-1944. The only countries on this part of the map of Europe that were still free were the neutral countries of Switzerland, Sweden, and Finland, and off the map, the UK, and also Spain and Portugal. Everything else was already under Nazi control, including Italy, which entered the war on the side of Germany. At the bottom of the map is Italy. Now on to the other half of the story. My mother, Lilo, is the little 2-year-old girl in the left photograph with her parents, Gertrude and Walter Wassel. She was born and raised in Berlin, had a somewhat different perspective on Hitler and the Nazi regime than did Rolf and family, who entered Germany as latecomers during the war. She's age 11 in the right photograph. And shortly after that, Hitler came to power when she was 13 years old, about 2 years after this. And she refused to join the League of German Girls, equivalent to the Hitler Youth for boys. She described them as sinister, atheistic, and fanatical. She wanted absolutely nothing to do with them. When it came time to decide whether to graduate early, she decided, I'm going to graduate early and go to work, because the very following year, she would have been forced to join the League of German Girls. Very soon, the Nazi regime dictated life in Germany from cradle to grave. Here she is at age 19. Now, Lilo also had a dream. You see that theme developing? That dream theme? For Lilo, it was a harmonious, loving, and supportive home life and marriage that she wanted more than anything. That did not exist for her parents during her growing up years. They had a very rocky marriage that ended in divorce when Lilo was only 13. And she just had this craving for something different. Well, her dream would soon commence. Very shortly after this photograph was taken, she met Rolf at an afternoon dance at the Olympic Stadium Cafe in Berlin. German World War II history is a cautionary tale. It is often brutal, oppressive regimes like the Putin, the Hitler, the Stalin regimes that impose world conflict, which makes so many people across the world suffer. And it doesn't really matter whether it's Marxist, communist, fascist, Nazi. They all have one common denominator, and that is dictatorship. It is dictatorship that should be prevented by all means possible. Hitler came to power in only a few years, and not by a military coup, but largely by legal means. And he had a crew of civilian thugs called the Brown Shirts or the Sturmabteilung to help him in that task. They attacked and dismantled democratic institutions. They took over the press and murdered or deported or executed or imprisoned his political opponents, alongside of millions of Jews, LGBTQ people, Roma or Gypsies, and other targeted groups. Hitler started out as a cult figure in the late 1920s, rapidly escalating to a brazen takeover of power by 1933. When the brown shirts no longer suited his purposes, Hitler betrayed them as well. He had most of them murdered in the Night of the Long Knives by the SS in 1934. And by that time, Germany had already morphed from a democracy with a free press to an absolute dictatorship under the pretense of restoring Germany's greatness. Hitler had absolutely no intention of ever stepping down from power. The other thing I want to add, something that I really found out more about relatively recently, is that Hitler also, I actually knew this, but I didn't know too many facts about it. Hitler created a Reich Church, R-E-I-C-H, Reich Church in Germany. It was the Protestant church in Germany that he completely distorted. It gave no credence to Christianity having Jewish origins. In other words, Jesus wasn't a Jew. The disciples weren't Jews. The prophets, the Old Testament kings and judges never existed. We pay no attention to those, not pertinent to the Reich church, also hideously aligned with Nazi ideology. As a result of this, to my absolute horror, I realized that the vast majority of Christians in Germany were either willingly or cluelessly complicit in Hitler's rise to power and all that followed. It is a major shameful factor in Christian history. Those who dissented, thousands of mostly Catholic priests and lay people, but also monks and nuns, and some pastors from the Confessing Church of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. How many have heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? All right, there's a new movie out about him. They were sent to camps and either executed or imprisoned for a fairly long time, along with people in targeted groups like Jews, Roma, and LGBTQ. One thing that I have to say is that we need to beware not only of distortion and corruption in our government, but also distortion and corruption in our faith tradition. Beware, be cautious, be knowledgeable. The measure of a man is what he does with power, and the price of apathy is to be ruled by evil men. Both of those quotes are from Plato, ancient Greek philosopher, but they are still pertinent today. And here's a quote from me. Democracy in the US and across the globe is completely dependent on vigilant, informed, and socially active citizens and leaders of integrity and goodwill. The city of Danzig or Gdańsk, which I showed you flying in on the map. Rolf soon received the welcome news that he would be allowed to finish his aeronautical engineering education in this city. Now, it was in occupied Poland, and once a free city of Europe, it was no longer. It was completely under Nazi domination by that time. Rolf hoped against hope that by the time he received his diploma, the war would be over. But that hope came crashing down when in late 1941, along with his diploma, on the very same day, he received his draft notice into the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Here, he's reading the Berliner Illustrierte, a Berlin newspaper, and it could be that he's reading a horrifying story about the war on the Eastern Front, instigated by Hitler himself. He attacked Russia, which was not supposed to happen based on the secret pact signed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But Hitler did it, and perhaps it's good that he did. Maybe we would not have won the war without the Soviet participation. Rolf was fortunate. He was not sent to the front until very late in the war. Instead, he was engaged in pursuits like airplane design and aeronautics. He was engaged in glider flight training, as here he's a guy sitting in the plane. And he also engaged in navigator training, hoping that by the time he finished his training, the war might be over. He wasn't sent to the front until very late on, and in addition, he was never forced to fly any combat or bombing missions against the Allies. Germany sustained 343,000 tons of bombs during the war. And in addition to Berlin, which of course had very bad bombing, does anyone know the two cities in Germany that sustained even worse bombing in terms of firestorms and the intensity of the bombing? And someone said Dresden and Hamburg. Yeah, wow, you folks are good. Here they come. Hamburg, Dresden. My father Rolf's home in Berlin was completely destroyed. We have this photo and both photos only as a result of the fact that he took bombing leave to go and inspect the damage. Lilo's home was also destroyed, one floor at a time, until finally the top 2 floors blown away, windows and walls shattered, pipes burst, and water flowing into the apartment. She and her mother, Gertrude, could no longer live there. But the word from the regime was, no working person leaves Berlin, but love and dreams. She and my grandmother Gertrude persisted, and eventually, when Lilo obtained a job in a small town northwest of Berlin that never did get bombed, they were allowed to move out of the beleaguered city in March of 1944. By that time, bombing was quite severe already. And a sad postscript to this is that most of Lilo's family, including her father, remained trapped in the Soviet zone of Germany that later became East Germany, and she never saw any of them again. Today, a similar thing is happening to the people of Ukraine. They are being tragically parted by the chaos, destruction, and tragedy of war. But fortunately, today, unlike after World War II, we have both NATO and the EU. The EU helps to coordinate aid and resettlement. And in fact, Poland, which was so much feared at the beginning of the war, it was the most dangerous place in all of Europe. Today, it is a wonderful refuge for people fleeing Ukraine. They have accepted, I think, more Ukrainian refugees than any other country. This is the only known photograph of my grandfather Ernst in the underground installation of Mittelwerk, where he was forced to work the last 14 months of the war as chief inspector of the V2, found among his personal effects in a box in a closet by my father Rolf after he passed away. Even my father didn't know much because Ernst never talked about his experience. We only knew what his title was. So I had to do a lot of research about his role during the war. And as it happened, it was a journey of discovery for my father and for me. It was an experience that we shared, finding out more about what Grandpa did. Now, to my abject horror, when I first began researching, I found out that there was a much feared slave labor camp outside the gates of the Mittelwerk installation, where tens of thousands of slave laborers toiled and died. There were also satellite camps all around the area. And this underground installation was perhaps most feared of any installation in or any slave labor camp in Germany or elsewhere. I wondered, what else will I find out? So I found out from books where my grandfather is mentioned by name that he had over 200 civilian and Army engineers working under him and 3 inmates. My heart was in my throat. What would I find out about my grandpa? The guy that fed me oatmeal in my high chair when I was a baby, and my younger brother too, the guy who had such a sparkling sense of humor. Well, I was relieved to find out that some of the former inmates had written books and post-war transcripts, and one of them was Yuri Benish, one of the 3 inmates in Grandpa's department. And he wrote that he had some wonderful conversations and communications with my grandfather, and it turned out that my grandfather saved his life. He kept him from being interrogated by the SS in the underground tunnel system. The SS ruled. They were much feared, and anyone could be executed there. Even German officers could be executed in the underground tunnels. I have 3 main regrets regarding my grandfather. First, that I didn't know the questions to ask him when he was alive. I wish I could ask him lots of questions now. Second, he probably never knew that Yuri Benish had survived the war. And the third one is that he may always be listed among the perpetrators, just for having worked in this place. There were only two kinds of people in this installation. There were the victims and there were the perpetrators. I would love to somehow exonerate him. An underground tunnel at the installation as it looks today. Today it is called the Mittelbau-Dora Concentration Camp Memorial. And it is a place that only commemorates and honors and remembers the men who gave their lives in this place, working as slave laborers. It does not honor the advanced rocket technology that took place there. In 1944, November, with the Allies poised to strike into Germany proper from the west and from the east, a love story was playing out that would span more than 70 years and across 2 continents. My parents, Rolf and Lilo, got married on November 24th, 1944. And at this point in the war, the worst times for German civilians and military personnel alike were still ahead. Within 6 months of these photographs, Lilo and Gertrude would be forced to flee the Soviet troops more than once, and Rolf and Ernst would be taken prisoner of war. Perhaps worst of all, for almost a year after this point in time, neither Rolf nor Lilo knew whether the other was still alive. This photograph of Rolf was taken very shortly before he was sent to the front. He was in Slovakia. He had been sent to a farm by the military where he actually worked on the farm in between military assignments. But then the worst came. The order came to depart for the front. And fortunately for Rolf and his unit, with the war as good as over and no personal weapons left to be given out, his unit was told to disperse. They walked homeward, cross-country, in late winter. Rolf walked 160 miles toward where he thought home might still be. And that, my friends, is a tragedy of war fought on home soil, is that not only military personnel, but also family, home, business, future, everything hangs in the balance. And that is what we see so tragically playing out in Ukraine today. Now, between this photograph and the next, I will tell you, I'm leaving out the most dramatic and cathartic part of the story for you to read about in my book if you like. We'd be here for a much longer time if I tried to tell that as well. And it is the story of how love, dreams, and faith in God, along with the activities and determination of my grandmother Gertrude, who is a major mover and shaker in this story, helped a family to reunite after the war and helped a family to survive the worst war in human history. My favorite photo of Rolf and Lilo, taken in post-war Bavaria, and they are smiling down at their post-war dream. My older brother, Ingo, here at age 2, and age 3, and at age 3, lo and behold, he has grown a tail. There, he has grown a tail. That tail was sewn onto his overalls by my grandmother Maria, who made the beautiful dress. She had a sense of humor, too. Now is a good time for me to mention what it's been like to be a child of German people all these years. My brother Ingo and I had questions about complicity and awareness, lifelong questions. How much did they, our parents and grandparents included, know about death camps and the Holocaust? On this subject, too, I had to do a lot of reading, research, and I had a lot of conversations with people, including with my parents. The conclusion I came to, we will never know what a lot of people knew. But my parents wrote about it in their family history. They didn't know until after the war ended. So who knew what? First of all, many people in the upper echelons of the government, the military, and industries that supplied the camps had much inside information, perhaps knew all of the gruesome facts. Also, everybody pretty much across Europe knew about concentration camps, the existence of them. What they did not necessarily know, as my parents said, what happened in them and who was sent there. Also, deportations were occurring. My father saw Jews rounded up in front of a synagogue. What did the Nazi regime say about this? The news reports said that people were being deported to be resettled on farms in Poland. Okay. Nazi-controlled media did not publicize the killings during the war, and neither did Allied media by and large. Also, Nazi propaganda helped to keep a segment of the population in the dark. Rolf and Lila were horrified to find out about the industrial-scale genocide after the war ended. And Ernst, how much did Ernst know? So there were slave labor camps at the two installations, and the inmate, Yuri Benish, had been to Auschwitz. They had some conversations. But the fact is that where Grandpa worked, both of those installations, small one at Peenemünde, large one at Middelwerk, they held primarily captured resistance fighters and partisans from countries with which Germany was at war, and not people from targeted groups by and large. We will never know the answers, unfortunately, to these questions, but there is a book on my suggested reading list, which I will send you if you signed up on my clipboard, entitled What We Knew by Johnson and Rubin. After interviewing thousands of people, the conclusion they reached, aside from we will never know, is that perhaps 1/3 of the German population knew everything, 1/3 might have suspected but had no proof, and 1/3 might have been completely clueless. The thing that we know today is that we, each of us, must be the eyes, ears, and voice of remembrance for this tragic and shameful chapter in human history. Post-war Germany was a humanitarian disaster site, inundated by more than 14 million homeless, hungry, destitute refugees. Everybody was starving, and that included my parents. The worst part, though, was the Soviet threat that still hung over all of Europe. Ernst encouraged Lilo and Rolf to immigrate to America, and they considered it. Here they are on the day of departure. Now I'd like to ask, do we have any immigrants in the audience? Yes, where from?
Greece.
Greece. Thank you very much for that. When did you come over?
December 1960.
1950. 1960, thank you. And did anyone else have their hand up? Okay, now, how many of you had parents who immigrated to the U.S.? Okay, also from Greece, and here from Poland.
Switzerland and Cuba.
Cuba?
And Switzerland.
And Switzerland. Oh, I heard about you. I heard about you. Yes, large family, right? And hands up over here. Where?
Poland.
Poland. Okay, two from Poland. And
Austria.
Austria. Oh, wow, thank you for that. Now, let's go to grandparents. How many grandparents? Okay, there's some others.
Lithuania.
Lithuania, right.
Lithuania and Poland.
Lithuania and Poland.
Ireland.
Ireland.
Canada.
Canada. Okay, and
England.
England. Who am I missing?
Finland.
Finland. Oh, I should talk to you. I had a man from Finland. He actually himself was an immigrant from Finland after the war, and he told me what happened in Finland during the war. Did you know that Finland was on the Axis side of the war initially? Because the Soviet Union attacked them, and then later on they switched. That was a bit of World War II history I did not know until he attended my presentation last fall. Okay, this photo was taken on our day of departure, December 1951. There they are with their suitcases. And most of the story about post-war, our immigration, and early years in the U.S. are something that I offer in a second presentation, which I hope the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire will invite me back for someday. And I've also applied to New Hampshire Humanities for acceptance. Perhaps they'll accept it. Most of it I tell in that part of the presentation. But I will mention this. On the day of departure, my mother was 8 months pregnant. And thanks to the fact that there was fog covering all of Northern Europe, and one night had to be spent in Switzerland because the plane could not take off, I started my life in a neutral country, Switzerland. Born in Zurich, she went into labor that night. We spent 11 days in a fine Swiss hospital and then immigrated to America. I am proud to be born in a neutral country. Here we are. I'm jumping ahead because most of this is post-war, but shortly before we became naturalized citizens, all except for my younger brother who's at the lower left. And right around this time, both my father, Rolf, and grandfather, Ernst, were hired by Chrysler Missile and Space Division near Detroit, where my father, Rolf, was head of a team of engineers that designed and built components of the Saturn 1B rocket, which were later used successfully in all of the Apollo moon missions. So I had to wrap my head around that one. The fact that not only was my father's aeronautical engineering dream not derailed by the chaos and destruction of war, but it actually increased to a role in the emerging U.S. space program. Amazing. Here, Apollo 11 liftoff. Components of this rocket were designed and built by my dad and team. After retirement, Rolf found a new meaning in his life. For over 30 years, living right here in the Granite State, yep, they moved from Michigan to New Hampshire, he volunteered with thousands of children and adults across the Granite State. Model rocketry, young astronaut programs, and other programs, and also talking about his World War II experience. My parents' love story is as much about finding meaning, establishing a dream, and living a life of faith in God as it was about surviving war. This final photograph from a 2013 model rocket launch, which Rolf still led, is a reminder that what we share lives on in the lives and memories of those we inspire. Meaning is what we use to construct and maintain our individual and collective futures. And I encourage each of you to find the gem of meaning in your own life that you can use to inspire and uplift other people. My hope is that together with the rest of the free world, we will launch a tomorrow free of dictatorship, war, and genocide, blessed with liberty, where all people will be able to fulfill their dreams and their life's purpose. And I thank you all.
Thank you. I think we have time. If people have some questions that would like to share with everyone, would this be a good time to do that for a few minutes? Go right ahead, raise your hand, speak right out.
I'm also going to go to one last slide.
Get out of the way.
My book is available for sale for $20, but you can also get it on Amazon in Kindle and print versions. In addition, my Gmail address is here if you want to contact me, but you don't want to sign up on my list. And there is a QR code to donate to New Hampshire Humanities. So now, questions? Anyone? Yes?
Do you have dual citizenship?
No, that was never an option. Switzerland does not have birthright citizenship. I don't believe they ever had it. So my options were, well, I could have had German and American dual because I had German parents, or I could have had just American or just German. Those were my options. But as an 8-year-old, I was going to go with whatever they were doing. Yes.
Did you say your father started working on the rocket technology in Germany? Or
No, that's the amazing thing. That didn't begin until here in the U.S. So in my post-war presentation, I talk about the fact that my grandfather kept in touch with Werner von Braun. They even communicated by mail after the war when Grandpa was still in Germany. And they had a reunion once my grandfather immigrated to the U.S. In 1957, there was a reunion in Flint, Michigan, where they got together. The press was there. A beautiful glossy photograph was taken of the two of them. And I don't believe, though, that von Braun was part of the fact that they were hired by Chrysler Missile and Space Division. The two of them just applied and were hired almost immediately. Maybe he wrote a testimonial. I'm not really sure about that. A lot of things that I wish I knew, but I didn't know the questions to ask way back then. So did that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you. Other questions?
Did you speak German in the house? Did you speak German?
Ja, ich spreche noch ein bisschen Deutsch. However, those skills can be very easily lost, as I found out during COVID when my husband and I weren't doing any traveling, because we do travel to Germany every now and then. I guess I need to get back there again to brush up on my German language. I saw another hand up somewhere. Yes.
So it seemed like you had a lot of pictures that helped you do what you did. If you don't have that, but you have a similar history, where do you start and you get there?
That's a tough one. Would I ever have written my book if my parents had not first written a family history and had this beautiful collection of photographs? I have all the albums still at my house. Most of them are in great condition, and I now have them all in electronic format as well. Plus, I'm able to do a little, perfecting and editing on the photos where they need it. That's hard, but I do recommend that anybody who has a story at least record it in an electronic file that you can pass on to posterity. I think that's very important. If you have a few photos, that's great. If you don't, you might be able to fill in with some things from online. There is a source called Picryl.com, Picryl. They have a lot of historic photographs, so you won't find photos of your family, but for example, the Apollo 11 liftoff photo that I showed is a free image from Picryl.com. It is a public domain NASA photo. And you can find other things there to make a story interesting, but maybe not quite as personalized as if you had family photos.
Do you think the Southern European story is as well documented as the Northern?
I'm sorry,
Do you think the Southern European story is as well documented as the Northern European story?
I don't really know. I don't know the answer to that.
Both I have a grandparent on both sides that has a story. One that goes through Italy, and one that goes through Russia and prisoner of war camps there.
Uh-huh.
I want to find out both, and I don't know where to start. And I've lost. My parents have both now gone. And
Yeah, that's the problem. Most of us don't think to ask questions and take down information. My parents were both still alive when I wrote my book.
we asked. My father would not say a word. Just like it was the worst thing that ever happened to him.
Oh, he didn't want to talk about it.
Never.
So that's another thing. I was very fortunate that my parents were willing. And my grandfather, I think he would have been willing, but when you're sworn to secrecy in your work and you work as a military person, I think you often take those experiences to the grave. The same as many Holocaust victims also did, the same as many veterans will do, they will not talk about it. and I understand that too. My family was fortunate. They were fortunate survivors of war. And much as I can't say that their dreams for the future and all of that saved their lives, but those factors, including their faith in God, definitely provided fertile ground for them to make wise decisions. If you see there is a future ahead for you, something you're looking forward to, even in the midst of adversity, I think you will find more ways to promote survival. That's what I think the key is. Was there another hand up? Yes.
What was the name, the author of that book you mentioned, Frankel?
Viktor Frankl. Yes, so on the suggested reading list I'll send you are books by Frankl. There are also videos on the list, and there are some websites on the list. And some books are on existential topics, like Frankl's books, and other books are solely regarding World War II. By the way, I'd like to ask, has anyone heard of the Wilhelm Gustloff? It was a ship that was used for recreational purposes, resort ship, before the war. It became a ship for refugees, moving refugees from the eastern part of Europe to Germany during the war. And that ship was sunk in the Baltic Sea by a Soviet submarine in January of 1945. It was the worst maritime disaster of all time, which hardly anyone has heard about. My dad said to me when I was writing my book, and he was doing some reading of it, he said, "You have to put the Wilhelm Gustloff in this story." So I looked it up, and indeed, almost 10,000 people lost their lives on that one ship in one night. The Titanic had maybe 12 or 1,300 victims. The Wilhelm Gustloff, Wilhelm. On my suggested reading list are books and websites. You can go to the websites for free and check out this story. It is truly haunting. I think is there anyone who would like to discuss anything like your family's history or anything from the war? If not, I think we will adjourn. I'll be over here. I have books that are already signed, but I'm willing to write something in them as well. So thank you again, everyone, for attending. Please check out Neil's exhibit. Neil Valentino put up an exhibit over here to the right, to your left, with photographs and other things pertaining to World War II. Thank you, everyone.